The scent of gardenias and expensive beeswax candles was usually enough to make Clarice Starling Hamilton feel a sense of mild nausea. But tonight, the suffocating weight of the Silvercrest ballroom felt like a physical hand around her throat. She stood by the velvet-draped pillars, her fingers white-knuckled around a glass of lukewarm champagne she had no intention of drinking. Around her, the crème de la crème of the kingdom's nobility fluttered like desperate moths around a single blinding flame. That flame was Dominic Toretto Vaughan, the Duke of Blackwood. He moved through the crowd with the predatory grace of a panther in a silk waistcoat. To the débutantes he was a god, to the merchants he was a gold mine, to the king he was the iron fist that kept the northern borders silent. But to Clarice, as she watched him tilt his head to whisper something into the ear of a blushing countess, something that undoubtedly made the woman feel like the center of the universe while he scanned the room for his next conquest, he was something else entirely. He was a lie. A beautifully packaged, gold-leafed, hollow-hearted lie. "He's looking this way," her sister Lydia hissed, pinching Clarice's arm. "Clarice, for the love of the heavens, straighten your corset. If he chooses you for the midnight waltz, our father's debts vanish by morning. I would rather rot in a debtor's prison than dance with a man who treats souls like trading cards," Clarice whispered back, her voice like flint striking steel. The music shifted, a low, haunting cello melody that seemed to signal the approach of a storm. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. Dominic was walking toward them. The air grew cold, the chatter dying into a stifling, expectant silence. He didn't look at Lydia. He didn't look at the jewels dripping from the necks of the women flanking him. His dark, piercing eyes, the color of a bruised midnight sky, were locked onto Clarice. He stopped inches from her, so close she could smell the expensive sandalwood and the faint metallic scent of old blood that seemed to cling to his reputation. He didn't bow. He didn't need to. He simply held out a gloved hand, a small, confident smirk playing on his lips, a look that suggested he already knew the answer. "They say you are the only woman in this room who hasn't practiced her curtsy in the mirror for my arrival," Dominic said, his voice a rich, vibrating baritone that made the floorboards hum. "I find that intriguing. Dance with me, Miss Hamilton." The room held its breath. Clarice felt the heat of 100 jealous glares boring into her back. She looked at his hand, then up into those arrogant, beautiful eyes. She didn't curtsy. She didn't blush. "I would rather dance on shards of glass," she said, her voice carrying through the silent hall like a gunshot. "The way you look at people as if they are merely tools for your boredom. It's vile. In fact, Your Grace, you don't intrigue me. You disgust me." The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was deafening. Lydia gasped, nearly fainting. The Duke's guards stepped forward, their hands twitching toward the hilts of their swords. No one spoke to the Duke of Blackwood like that. Not if they valued their breath. Dominic's smirk didn't falter. It widened. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face. Not the practiced mask of a nobleman, but the look of a man who had finally found something real in a world of cardboard cutouts. "Disgust," he mused, his voice dropping to a dangerous, intimate whisper. "A strong emotion. Far more honest than love. Hello, my wonderful viewers. It is so incredibly good to have you back here with me today. Before we dive deeper into the mystery of why the Duke chose the one woman who hated him, I want to take a quick moment to say hello. I'm so grateful for this community. Where are you watching from today? Drop your country or city in the comments below. I love seeing how far our stories travel. I hope you're all doing amazing. If you're enjoying this tale of defiance and dark secrets, please take a second to hit that subscribe button and join our family here. It helps the channel immensely and ensures you never miss a twist. Now back to the ballroom where the air is thick with scandal. Clarice's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, but she refused to let her gaze drop. She expected him to ruin her. She expected the guards to drag her out. She expected the social death of her entire family. Instead, Dominic Toretto Vaughan turned to the master of ceremonies without taking his eyes off Clarice's defiant face. "Cancel the waltz," the Duke commanded, his voice ringing with an authority that brooked no argument. "The search for a consort is over." He reached out not to grab her, but to gently tuck a stray lock of dark hair behind her ear. His touch was electric, a searing heat that made Clarice flinch. "I choose this one," he announced to the stunned assembly. "Clarice Hamilton will be the one to dine at my table tonight. And every night thereafter until she finds me, less disgusting. As the room erupted into a cacophony of whispers and outraged gasps, Clarice realized with a sinking horror that her honesty hadn't set her free. It had turned her into the Duke's new obsession. And in the shadows of the Blackwood estate, obsessions rarely ended in anything but blood. Why would a man who could have any woman choose the only one who spat in his face? And what was the Duke hiding behind that terrifying, charming smile? The carriage ride to the Blackwood estate was a nightmare wrapped in velvet. Clarice sat as far from Dominic as the mahogany bench allowed, her eyes fixed on the passing shadows of the ancient forest. The Duke didn't speak. He simply watched her, his chin resting on a gloved fist, observing her like a scientist would a new volatile element. Clarice wasn't just a defiant girl from a falling house. She was a woman fueled by a very specific burning fire. 3 years ago her father, Arthur Shelby Birkin, had been a man of stature until a business arrangement with the previous Duke of Blackwood stripped him of his shipping fleet and his dignity. Her father hadn't just lost money, he'd lost his spirit, becoming a ghost who paced their drafty halls at night. Clarice had spent every day since then repairing the holes in their lives, working as a ledger keeper in secret to pay off their mounting debts. Her deepest fear wasn't poverty. It was becoming like the people in that ballroom. Shallow shells who would sell their souls for a nod from a man who didn't care if they lived or died. "You're calculating the cost of the silk on these seats, aren't you?" Dominic's voice broke the silence, startlingly soft. "I'm calculating how many families could be fed for a month by the gold thread in your waistcoat, Your Grace," Clarice snapped, finally meeting his gaze. "But I suppose the view is different from the top of a mountain of corpses." Dominic's expression darkened, a flicker of something raw and unpolished crossing his features before the mask slid back into place. "You think I enjoyed that circus back there? The bowing? The scraping? They don't see me, Clarice. They see a title. They see a vault. You looked at me and saw a monster. At least a monster is a living thing." The carriage lurched to a halt before the gargantuan iron gates of the Blackwood Manor. Waiting for them was Alfred Pennyworth Wentworth, the Duke's head of household. Alfred was a man whose face looked like it had been carved from granite, but his eyes held a strange, weary kindness. Beside him stood Beatrix Kiddo Loomis, the Duke's personal guard and a woman whose reputation for lethal efficiency was known across 3 continents. "The guest wing is prepared, Your Grace," Alfred said, bowing stiffly. He cast a curious, almost sympathetic look at Clarice. "She isn't a guest, Alfred," Dominic said, stepping out and offering Clarice a hand she pointedly ignored. "She is the new fixture of this house. See that she has everything she needs, and triple the guard on the perimeter. Miss Hamilton has a habit of being difficult." Clarice was led through hallways that felt more like a museum than a home. Every painting, every vase, screamed of a history soaked in power. But as she was settled into a room that was larger than her father's entire cottage, she realized the stakes were higher than she imagined. While being escorted, she'd overheard Beatrix whispering to a subordinate about the shipment from the north, and silencing the dissenters. Clarice's motivation shifted. She wasn't just here to survive, she was in the belly of the beast. If she could find proof of the Duke's corruption, the same corruption that ruined her father, she could bring him down. But as she watched Dominic from her balcony later that night, seeing him stand alone in the moonlit courtyard with his head bowed, looking less like a tyrant and more like a man carrying the weight of a crumbling world, a seed of intrigue took root. What secret was so heavy that the most powerful man in the kingdom sought out the company of someone who hated him, just to feel a moment of truth? And was Clarice brave enough to find out, or would the Duke's world swallow her whole before she could strike? "I see so many of you joining us from all over the globe. Thank you for being here. This story is just getting started and the tension is about to explode. If you're feeling the heat between Clarice and the Duke, let me know in the comments. Do you think he's truly a monster or just misunderstood? And if you haven't yet, click that subscribe button. It's the best way to support the channel and keep these emotional journeys coming." As Clarice turned away from the balcony, she found a small, unmarked envelope slipped under her door. Inside was a single tarnished key and a note in a cramped, hurried hand. "Not everything in Blackwood is what it seems. Look beneath the rose garden." Her heart skipped a beat. The game had truly begun. The clock in the grand hallway struck 3 in the morning, a mournful chime that echoed through the stone corridors like a funeral bell. Clarice didn't hesitate. Clad in a dark silk robe and clutching the tarnished key, she slipped out of her room, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The note had been a lifeline, or a lure, and she was too desperate for the truth to care which. She navigated the labyrinthine manor, dodging the rhythmic patrols of guards led by the stone-faced Beatrix. The air grew colder as she reached the glass-domed conservatory, where the scent of 1,000 roses was so cloying it felt like a physical weight. Following the note's cryptic instructions, she pushed aside a heavy stone planter near the center of the garden, revealing a narrow, rusted iron hatch. The key turned with a groan of complaining metal. Below lay a spiral staircase that smelled of damp earth and ancient secrets. Clarisse descended, her candle flickering in the sudden draft, until she reached a vaulted chamber filled with rows upon rows of filing cabinets and heavy leather-bound ledgers. This wasn't a dungeon, it was an archive. Looking for a way to destroy me or just looking for a reason to stay? Clarisse whirled around, the candle flame dancing wildly. Dominic stood in the shadows of the archway, his coat discarded, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar. He didn't look like the untouchable Duke of the ballroom. He looked exhausted, his eyes shadowed with a haunting fatigue. "I'm looking for justice," Clarisse spat, stepping toward him despite the fear prickling her skin. "I'm looking for the records of how you bled the shipping guilds dry. How you ruined men like my father while you drank wine that costs more than their lives." Dominic stepped into the light, and for the first time, Clarisse saw the scars on his forearms, faint, jagged lines that spoke of a life far more violent than any noble's should be. "Then look," he said, gesturing to the stacks of paper. "But you won't find my name on those debts, Clarisse. You'll find the king's. You'll find the council's. You'll find that I've spent the last 5 years buying back those debts in secret to keep families like yours from being tossed into the streets." He pulled a heavy ledger from the shelf and shoved it toward her. Clarisse's hands trembled as she flipped through the pages. There was Shelby Birkin, Arthur. Debt purchased by Blackwood Estate. Interest waived. Repayment suspended indefinitely. "Why?" she whispered, her world tilting on its axis. "Why let everyone believe you're the villain?" "Because a villain is feared," Dominic said, stepping closer, his presence suddenly overwhelming. "And fear is the only thing that keeps the king's assassins away from my throat. If the world knew I was helping the dissenters, I wouldn't live to see the sunrise. And neither would anyone I care for." The revelation hit Clarisse like a physical blow. The danger she had sensed wasn't coming from him, it was surrounding him. Before she could process the shock, the heavy iron door at the top of the stairs slammed shut. Muffled shouts echoed from above, followed by the unmistakable ring of steel on steel. "The King's Guard," Dominic hissed, his entire demeanor shifting into that of a soldier. He grabbed Clarisse's arm, his grip firm but not painful. "They've moved sooner than I expected. Someone betrayed the location of the archive." "Wait, if they find us here," Clarisse started, her mind racing. "If they find us here, we're both executed for treason," Dominic finished, his eyes burning with a sudden, fierce intensity. "But I have no intention of dying tonight. Not when I've finally found the only person in this kingdom honest enough to hate me." In the narrow, torchlit space, the hatred Clarisse had carried for years flickered and died, replaced by a terrifying electric attraction. He was a man drowning in a sea of lies, and she was the only shore he had left. He pulled a hidden lever behind a shelf and a section of the wall swung open. "Come with me," he commanded. "If we survive the next hour, I'll give you the head of the man who truly ruined your father. But right now you have to trust the monster." Clarisse looked at his hand, the same hand she had rejected in the ballroom. This time she took it. "Are you guys still with me? The mask is falling off and the real danger is just beginning. Who do you think betrayed the Duke? Was it the silent Alfred or the lethal Beatrix? I need to hear your theories in the comments. And if you're enjoying this high-stakes romance, make sure you've subscribed. We're moving into the heart of the storm and you won't want to miss what happens next." As they plunged into the darkness of the escape tunnel, a massive explosion rocked the manor above. The ceiling of the archive began to crumble, showering them in dust and stone. The Duke shielded Clarisse with his body, his heart thundering against her back. The hunt had begun and the prize was no longer just the Blackwood title. It was their very lives. The escape tunnel was a narrow, claustrophobic artery of damp stone that ran beneath the estate for miles. Every few minutes, The ground above them groaned with the weight of the king's cavalry. Clarice's lungs burned from the dust and her slippers were shredded by the jagged floor, but Dominic didn't let go of her hand. His grip was a constant, grounding force in the darkness. "We can't stay in the tunnels forever," Clarice whispered, her breath hitching as a distant boom echoed through the passage. Beatrix. She was in charge of the perimeter. How did they get past her? "In my world, Clarice, loyalty is a currency that fluctuates with the market," Dominic replied, his voice a grim rasp. He stopped at a rusted ladder leading upward. "Beatrix is loyal to the crown first, the title second and the man third. If the king gave the order, she wouldn't hesitate to put a bolt through my heart." They emerged into a derelict hunting lodge on the far edge of the Blackwood Woods. Rain lashed against the windows and the wind howled through the cracks in the timber. Dominic immediately began barricading the door, his movements precise and lethal. Clarice watched him, noticing the way his shirt was now soaked with blood. Not hers but his. A jagged piece of masonry from the archive collapse had sliced deep into his shoulder. "You're bleeding," she said, moving toward him. "It's a scratch," he dismissed, though he winced as he shoved a heavy oak table against the entrance. "Don't lie to me." "Not now," Clarice countered, her voice firm. She tore a long strip of fabric from the hem of her silk robe. "Sit down, Your Grace. That's an order from someone who finds you slightly less disgusting than she did an hour ago." A ghost of a smile touched his lips as he slumped against the wall. As Clarice knelt before him to tend to the wound, the air between them shifted. The adrenaline of the escape began to fade, replaced by a heavy, pulsing awareness. In the flickering light of a single tallow candle she'd found on the mantel, the Duke looked vulnerable. The monster was just a man, scarred and exhausted. "Why me, Dominic?" she asked softly as she cleaned the wound. "Out of all the women who would have worshipped you, why choose the one who insulted you in front of the world?" "Because they all wanted the Duke," he said, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her hands tremble. "They wanted the power, the jewels, the security. You were the only one who saw the man and dared to tell him he wasn't good enough. I've spent my life surrounded by mirrors that only show me what I want to see. You're a window, Clarice. You showed me the truth." His hand reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek. Clarice didn't pull away. The hatred she had nurtured for years was a cold hearth, and his touch was the spark that set it ablaze into something else entirely. The tension was no longer just about the soldiers outside. It was about the space between their lips. "I spent years dreaming of your downfall," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "I thought if I hated you enough, I could fix what happened to my father. And now I realize I was hating a ghost," she said. "But the man in front of me is very, very real." The moment was shattered by the sound of a horn, the chilling, high-pitched signal of the king's black hussars. They were close. Dominic stood, his hand going to the hilt of a hidden dagger in his boot. "They'll be here within the hour. We can't head back to the city. We have to head north to the border. If we can reach the Iron Pass, I have allies who still honor the Blackwood name." But as they prepared to leave, Clarice noticed something in the mud outside the lodge window. A set of boot prints that didn't belong to soldiers. They were small, narrow, and headed toward the back of the lodge. Someone was already inside. "Dominic, wait." A shadow moved in the corner of the room. A blade flashed in the candlelight. "Oh my goodness, the stakes just got even higher. I can feel my heart racing. Can you? We've got assassins in the shadows and an army on the horizon. Who do you think is hiding in that lodge? Could it be a friend or a deadly foe? Let me know your best guesses in the comments below. And hey, if you're enjoying this intense ride, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications." Clarice lunged toward Dominic, pushing him aside just as a crossbow bolt thudded into the wood where his head had been a second before. Out of the darkness stepped a figure wrapped in a gray cloak. Not a soldier, but someone Clarice recognized from her father's past. "The Duke has a lot of enemies, Miss Hamilton," the figure hissed, raising a second crossbow. "But you shouldn't have chosen the winning side so late in the game." The forest was a blur of skeletal branches and stinging rain as Clarice stumbled through the undergrowth. Behind her, the night exploded into a symphony of violence. The clash of steel, the panicked whinnying of horses, and the guttural roar of Dominic's defiance. She wanted to scream, to turn back and bury the Duke's dagger into the heart of anyone touching him, but the weight of the letters against her chest reminded her of her grim duty. She was no longer just a girl with a grudge. She was a living vault of the king's sins. Hours bled into a fever dream of exhaustion. By the time the gray, sickly light of dawn filtered through the canopy, Clarice had reached the edge of the Iron Pass, a treacherous, narrow gorge that served as the gateway to the Northern Territories. But she wasn't alone. Standing at the mouth of the pass, silhouetted against the rising mist, was Beatrix Kiddo Loomis. The Duke's personal guard stood with her feet planted wide, her dual blades unsheathed and gleaming with a cold, predatory light. Behind her stood 6 black hussars, their obsidian armor slick with rain. "The Duke fought like a man possessed," Beatrix said, her voice devoid of emotion like the sharpening of a blade. "It took 12 men to bring him down. He's currently in chains headed for the Blackwood gallows. The king wants his head by sunset." Clarice felt the ground vanish beneath her. In chains. Heading for the gallows. The image of Dominic, arrogant, brilliant, broken Dominic, facing a butcher's blade made her soul shrivel. "He trusted you," Clarice whispered, her voice cracking. "He called you his sword. A sword doesn't choose its master, Miss Hamilton. It belongs to the hand that pays the highest tribute," Beatrix replied, stepping forward. "Give me the letters Lando stole from the palace. If you do, I'll ensure your death is quick. If you don't, the king has very creative ways of making a woman speak." Clarice looked at the gorge behind her and the blades in front. She was exhausted, outnumbered, and unarmed save for a single dagger. For the first time in her life, the fire that had driven her felt like it was flickering out. She had lost her father's legacy, her home, and now the man who had looked past her hatred to see her worth. "He chose me," Clarice said to the wind, her fingers tightening around the hilt of the dagger. "He chose me above all others." She realized then that Dominic hadn't just sent her away to save her life. He had sent her away because she was the only one who could save his. If she died here, the truth died with her. If she gave up, the king won, and Dominic's sacrifice would be nothing more than a footnote in a tyrant's history. But the odds were insurmountable. Beatrix moved with a blur of speed, her boot connecting with Clarice's ribs and sending her sprawling into the mud. The letters spilled out, scattering across the wet earth. Clarice lunged for them, but a hussar's heavy boot pinned her hand to the ground. "Pathetic," Beatrix sneered, raising her sword for the final blow. "You were just a distraction for him. A momentary lapse in judgment for a man who should have known better." As the blade began its descent, Clarice closed her eyes, a single tear carving a path through the grime on her face. The silence of the forest felt absolute. She had failed him. She had failed her father. She was going to die in the mud, and the world would continue to worship the monsters in silk. "I can't believe we've reached this point. My heart is actually in my throat. Clarice is down, Dominic is in chains, and the truth is about to be trampled into the dirt. Is this really how it ends? Can Clarice find the strength to rise one last time? I need you to flood the comments with 'Rise Clarice' if you believe she can turn this around. And if you're not subscribed yet, do it now. You cannot miss the turning point. This is the moment where legends are born or buried forever." Just as the steel was about to bite into her neck, a low rhythmic thrumming began to shake the ground. It wasn't the sound of the king's horses. It was deeper, heavier. From the mists of the Iron Pass, a horn sounded, a deep ancient blast that signaled the arrival of the Northern Iron Lords. "In the name of the Hamilton Shipping Guild," a voice bellowed from the fog. Clarice's eyes snapped open. The boot on her hand vanished as the hussar was thrown back by a heavy crossbow bolt. Through the haze of her pain she saw them, the men her father had once commanded, the sailors and merchants Lando had tried to ruin, led by a man she hadn't seen in years, her father's old first mate. They weren't there for the Duke. They were there for her. The Iron Pass erupted into chaos as the northern dissenters surged forward, a wall of wool and iron crashing against the obsidian-clad black hussars. Clarice scrambled to her feet, her fingers clawing through the mud to reclaim the king's letters. Her ribs screamed in protest, but the sight of her father's colors, the tattered blue and silver of the Hamilton Guild, acting as a shield, gave her a surge of adrenaline that tasted like lightning. Beatrix Kiddo Loomis snarled, her dual blades spinning in a defensive arc as she backed away from the sudden onslaught. "You're siding with a traitor's daughter?" she spat at the approaching woodsman. "The king will have your villages burned for this. The king has been burning our livelihoods for years. a grizzled man with a scarred face shouted, stepping to Clarice's side. It was Han Solo Vane, her father's former quartermaster. He caught Clarice as she stumbled, his eyes softening for a fraction of a second. "We heard the Duke was moving to help us. We didn't believe it until we saw Lando Beckett fleeing like a rat with the king's gold. We're with you, Miss Clarice. To the end." Clarice stood tall, the wind whipping her hair into a dark crown. She wasn't the trembling girl from the ballroom anymore. The Duke had chosen her because she was a window to the truth, and now she would be the glass that cut the king's hands. "The Duke is being taken to the Blackwood gallows," Clarice commanded, her voice ringing with a newfound authority that silenced the clash of steel. "He risked everything to expose the king's rot. If he dies, the evidence of our ruin dies with him. We aren't just saving a man, we are taking back our kingdom." A roar of approval went up from the northern men. Even Beatrix hesitated, seeing the sheer number of blades leveled at her. She was a professional, and professionals knew when the wind had shifted. "The gallows are 3 hours away by horse," Beatrix said, slowly lowering her weapons. A strange, twisted respect flickered in her eyes as she looked at Clarice. "You'll never make it in time. The king's executioner doesn't wait for sunset when a duke is on the block." "Then you're going to help us," Clarice said, stepping right up to the lethal guard. She held up the king's letters. "You're a sword, Beatrix. And right now, the hand that pays the highest tribute is the one that can guarantee you a place in the new world we're about to build. Join us or die in the mud for a king who would replace you in a heartbeat." The silence was tense, the only sound the heavy breathing of men and the drip of rain from the trees. Finally, Beatrix let out a short, sharp laugh and sheathed her blades. The Duke always did have a knack for finding the most dangerous things in the room. "Fine. There's a shortcut through the Weeping Ravine. If we ride like the devil is chasing us, we might catch the carriage before it reaches the estate." "I'm screaming. Did you see that? Clarice just recruited the woman who was trying to kill her. That is the power of a woman who knows her worth. We are heading into the final confrontation and I can already feel the heat of the battle. Can they reach Dominic before the blade falls? Drop a 'hurry' in the comments if you're rooting for them. And please, if you haven't subscribed, do it now. You are about to witness the most satisfying resolution in the history of this channel." They moved like a storm. Han provided the horses and Beatrix took the lead, her knowledge of the terrain cutting their travel time in half. As they thundered toward the Blackwood estate, Clarice clutched the Duke's dagger. She thought of his smile, the one he gave her after she'd insulted him. It wasn't the smile of a monster. It was the smile of a man who had finally found someone worth fighting for. "I'm coming for you, Dominic," she whispered into the rushing wind. "And this time I'm the one choosing you." As the jagged towers of the Blackwood gallows appeared on the horizon, silhouetted against a blood-red sky, Clarice saw the heavy iron carriage surrounded by a phalanx of guards. The executioner was already standing on the platform, his black hood a dark stain against the sunset. The turning point had arrived. It was time for the disgusting Duke and the destitute girl to burn the old world down. The roar of the northern dissenters was drowned out by the thunder of hooves as Clarice and her ragtag army crested the hill overlooking the Blackwood execution square. The scene below was a vision of hell. The king's herald was already reading the death warrant, his voice amplified by the stone walls of the courtyard. On the wooden platform, Dominic was on his knees, his hands bound behind him in heavy iron manacles. His shirt was torn, his face bruised, but even with a shadow of a blade hanging over him, he held his head with the ferocity of a king. "Charge!" Beatrix bellowed, her dual blades flashing as she led the vanguard straight into the line of unsuspecting black hussars. The square erupted into a frantic, bloody melee. The king's guards, expecting a somber execution, were completely unprepared for the fury of the Hamilton Guild. Clarice didn't stay on the fringes. She rode her horse through the thick of the fighting, her eyes locked onto the gallows. The executioner, seeing the chaos, panicked. He reached for the lever to drop the trapdoor. "No!" Clarice screamed. She leaped from her horse while it was still in motion, tumbling across the stone before scrambling to her feet. She pulled the Duke's dagger from her belt and hurled it with every ounce of desperation she possessed. The blade whistled through the air, burying itself in the executioner's forearm just as he began to pull the lever. He shrieked, clutching his arm, and Clarice used the momentary distraction to sprint up the wooden steps. She reached the top just as two guards lunged for her. But they never touched her. A blur of steel crossed their paths as Beatrix appeared, her movements a lethal dance of retribution. "Get him out of here," Beatrix commanded, not even looking back as she parried 3 blades at once. Clarisse knelt beside Dominic. His eyes, dark and wild, met hers, and for a heartbeat the war around them vanished. "You came back," he rasped, a crooked, bloody smile touching his lips. "I told you," she whispered, her hands shaking as she used the executioner's fallen keys to fumble with his shackles. "You disgust me, Dominic Torettovon. I couldn't let you die before I finished telling you why." The iron cuffs fell away with a heavy clank. Dominic didn't waste a second. He stood, grabbing the executioner's heavy axe and turning it toward the royal herald who was trying to flee with the king's seal. "Stop." Dominic's voice boomed, a sound of such raw power that the fighting in the square began to falter. The king's personal representative, a man named Lucius Malfoy Kovacs, froze. He turned, his face pale as he looked at the duke, now free, armed, and backed by the very people the crown had tried to crush. "This is treason," Lucius shrieked. "The Duke of Blackwood is a dead man." "No," Clarisse said, stepping forward beside Dominic. She held the king's letters high for everyone to see, the soldiers, the merchants, and the commoners who had gathered to watch the execution. The only treason here was written by the king himself. These letters proved the crown conspired to rob its own citizens, to frame the duke, and to murder the Hamilton family to cover its debts. She began to read the letters aloud, her voice steady and piercing. As the words of the king's betrayal rang out, the Black Hussars began to lower their weapons. They were men of the kingdom, and they realized they were fighting for a thief dressed in ermine. "The duke didn't betray the people," Han Solo Vane shouted from the crowd. "The king betrayed us all." Dominic stepped toward Lucius, the axe resting on his shoulder. "Go back to the capital," Dominic commanded, his voice cold as the grave. "Tell the king that the North no longer recognizes his seal. Tell him that the Duke of Blackwood has found something more valuable than a title. I have found an ally he cannot bribe and a woman he cannot break." The duke turned to the crowd, his arms sweeping out to include the battered sailors and the defiant Clarisse. "Today, Blackwood is no longer a dukedom of the crown. It is a sanctuary for the truth." The square erupted, not in a roar of war but in a deafening cry of victory. The monsters had been unmasked, and the man who was hated by the world was being carried on the shoulders of the people he had secretly saved. "I am shaking. That was the most intense showdown I have ever seen." Clarisse saving Dominic on the gallows? The letters being read to the whole square? Justice has been served. But the story isn't over yet. How do they build a future from the ashes of a revolution? I need to see your victory emojis in the comments right now. And if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? This is the emotional payoff we've all been waiting for, and the conclusion is going to be absolutely beautiful. Dominic dropped the axe and turned to Clarisse. The adrenaline was fading, leaving only the raw, pulsing truth between them. He reached out, his fingers tracing the bruise on her cheek where she had fallen. "You saved me," he whispered, his eyes shining with a vulnerability he had never shown another soul. "I saved my future," she replied. He pulled her into his arms, and right there on the platform meant for his death, he kissed her with a passion that promised 1,000 tomorrows. The girl who had told him he was disgusting was now the only reason he wanted to be a better man. The seasons in Blackwood changed with a softness that Clarisse had never noticed before. 6 months had passed since the blood-red sunset at the gallows, and the kingdom, now a burgeoning sovereign territory known as the Northern Coalition, was thriving. The king's influence had been severed at the Iron Pass, his corruption exposed so thoroughly that he dared not send another army to face the united front of the Northern Lords and the Hamilton Guild. Clarisse stood in the center of the restored Hamilton shipping docks, the air smelling of salt, fresh pine, and the bustling energy of honest trade. Beside her, her father, Arthur Shelby Birkin, looked 10 years younger. His eyes were clear, his spirit restored as he directed the loading of a new fleet, vessels built with Blackwood timber and funded by the very duke he once feared. "The ledgers are balanced, father," Clarisse said, handing him a leather-bound book. "And Lando Beckett's seized assets have cleared the final debts of every merchant in the district." "I never thought I'd see the day, Clarisse," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. He looked toward the manor on the hill. And I never thought I'd owe my life to the man I spent years cursing. You saw what I couldn't. Clarice smiled, her gaze drifting toward the path where a black horse was galloping toward the docks. I just refused to look at the mask, Father. I wanted to see the man. Dominic Toretto Vaughan arrived in a cloud of dust, dismounting before the horse had even come to a full stop. He was no longer draped in the suffocating gold and velvet of the royal court. He wore simple high-quality leather and a linen shirt, his sleeves rolled up to reveal the scars that no longer needed to be hidden. He looked like a man who had finally stepped out of a cold shadow and into the sun. He walked straight to Clarice, ignoring the bows of the sailors, and took her hands in his. "The council has reached a decision," he said, his voice vibrating with a quiet joy. "The coalition is official. We aren't just a territory anymore, we're a home. And they've asked for a representative to lead the new assembly." "And let me guess," Clarice teased, a mischievous glint in her eyes. "The Duke of Blackwood was their first choice?" "Actually," Dominic said, pulling her closer until their foreheads touched, "they chose the woman who had the courage to tell a duke he was disgusting. They want someone who can't be bought, won't be intimidated, and sees through every lie." Clarice laughed, the sound bright and clear over the crashing waves. "I think I can handle that. But only if I have a very stubborn, very honest duke by my side to keep things interesting." "Always," Dominic whispered. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sea in shades of amber and rose, Dominic reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, simple ring. It wasn't the heavy, gaudy signet of his house. It was a band of northern iron, set with a single brilliant diamond that caught the light like a star. "In the ballroom, I chose you because you were the only real thing in a world of ghosts," he said, his voice dropping to that intimate, soul-stirring register. "Now I'm asking you to choose me. Not out of debt, not out of duty, but because you're the only person who truly knows who I am, and you stayed anyway." Clarice looked at the ring, then up into the eyes of the man who had risked his life to save her family's honor. The disgust had long since burned away, replaced by a love so deep and fierce it felt like a part of her soul. "I chose you the moment you smiled at me in that archive, Dominic," she said softly. "I just took a little while to admit it." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and as they kissed, the docks erupted in cheers. Behind them, Beatrix stood with Han Solo Vane, the former assassin, offering a rare, genuine smile as she toasted the couple with a flask of northern ale. The world was still dangerous, and the future was still unwritten, but for the first time in their lives they weren't fighting for survival. They were living for each other. The Duke had chosen the one woman who challenged him, and in doing so he had found his own redemption. And Clarice, the girl who refused to bow, had found a partner who finally deserved her respect. "We have reached the end of our journey, and my heart is just overflowing with joy." Seeing Clarice and Dominic find their happy ending after so much betrayal and darkness is exactly why I love sharing these stories with you. They proved that honesty is the most powerful weapon of all. I want to hear from you one last time. What was your favorite moment? Was it the reveal of the king's letters, or that beautiful proposal at the docks? Let me know in the comments. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. Your support allows me to keep bringing these emotional, addictive stories to life. Thank you for watching, for commenting, and for being such an amazing community. I'll see you in the next story. As the stars began to twinkle over the quiet waters of Blackwood, the two of them walked back toward the manor, hand in hand. The past was a memory, the present was a gift, and the future was a promise they would keep together. The end.